Hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome back to UCSF Department of Pediatrics a colleague that I've known for many, many years, Dr. Brian Jin, and he sent a little bio that is so long and so detailed that I might as well not read it. That's a joke, and it's a bad joke, but it really doesn't actually say a whole lot about all the fantastic things that Dr. Jin has done and is doing. So for those of you who don't know, Dr. Jin had a long history at UCSF, came here for training and stayed on faculty for several years, served as Associate Program Director for the Pediatric Hospitalist Medicine Fellowship. I was very involved with student education, resident education, and I would always really love reading his evaluations because people just simply loved Brian as a clinician, as an educator. And he got so interested in education during his time here that he actually got a PhD in education from the combined program at UCSF and the University of Utrecht. And in that time got very interested in artificial intelligence and education. He's really done a lot of great work on that, including a recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine, co-authored with Christy Boscardin, who's here at UCSF. And while we were very sad to see him leave us for a position at the University of Illinois in Chicago now a little over a year ago, I think. We're also really happy that he decided to come back. I believe he still have family in the Bay Area, so that's a good excuse. But really to come back here as we have some events going on campus that are around artificial intelligence and education. And he is going to tell us a lot about his experiences with AI and education and some of the challenges and some of the opportunities. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Oh, and these are the upcoming presentations, but this is for today. Bye.
Thank you so much, Andrea. All right, thanks so much, everyone, for being here. You can hear me all right? Okay, it's so good to see you all again. And it honestly just feels like I went through some long overnight shift, then I woke up, and then now I'm back here for another day on the wards, to be honest. I can't believe that it's been already a year. And so many of you, I think I really miss you so much. And so thank you all for coming, and so good to see you all again. All right, so I started to make this talk with the title of Entrusting Our Learners with Artificial Intelligence in mind. But I realized that the title actually is probably not fitting. Oh goodness, it's going to read my annotations to this. Okay. So I realized that maybe the title wasn't really that fitting, and maybe the word "with" is actually not the right one. So if we're entrusting our learners to use AI tools such as open evidence, a given virtual patient of the day, or any type of other system in which AI gives the learner feedback, then we're not only entrusting them with the AI, but we're also entrusting them essentially to the AI, meaning that we're giving some of our responsibility as educators, as clinicians, over to an AI itself by virtue of allowing them to use the tool. And so then it becomes a relatively slippery slope after that in terms of the AI itself and how much agency it may be exerting in that particular role. So if we entrust our learners to an AI, it could also mean that they eventually become controlled by them in some way. Or in the worst case scenario, it could mean that they even become AIs in that sense, in terms of just a conduit between the patient and open evidence, say, or some other clinician support system. So how do we prevent this type of dystopian future from appearing? And how do we sort of temper our expectations and the roles in which AI can potentially contribute to? So I think it comes down to the question of, can we really trust AI? And if so, how well does the concept of trust apply to AI itself? And how may AI affect trust that's already there in the clinical learning environment, the trust that's between humans? So just a quick primer on trust in the clinical learning environment, of which I'm very sure you're completely familiar with as well. But it's a very complicated and convoluted topic that I think that involves many, many different connections. On the micro level, sort of between patient, trainee, and supervisor, it involves multiple directions and involves questions such as, from the patient point of view, are the trainees' assessments and plans credible? From the trainee, they may also have trust in the patient about whether the patient sees them as their provider or not. And finally, from the supervisor, a question may be, can I maintain oversight of the trainee without compromising their credibility? So can I support them without just sort of getting in their way? So in this clinical learning environment, everyone is essentially a trustor and both a trustee at the same time. And it's very complicated. So how does AI change this picture, especially if you have an AI supervisor, or say you have ChatGPT or Versa Curate or one of these other entities jumping into this already complicated picture? So maybe let's take a step back and think about what trust is in itself. So there's many different definitions, and this happens to be one that was relatively popular by Meyer and Meyer. So they describe it as a willingness of a trustor to be vulnerable to another party, who's the trustee. And this trustee cannot be monitored always or controlled. So in a sense, the trustor, the person giving the trust, is taking a risk by placing responsibility, maybe some responsibility that was originally theirs, to the party that's being trusted. So if trust is only just about vulnerability and risk taking, then in a way, how is it different than placing a bet? Because if you place a bet, say on, I don't know, I'm not a bet whore, but if you're let's say buying a stock, it's kind of like placing a bet, right? And so you're becoming vulnerable to that potential company, and you're taking a risk in it. But I don't really trust that company, right? If I'm buying their stock. And furthermore, if I'm short selling it, then I definitely don't trust the company, or I trust them to fail, right? So I think this definition of trust needs to be more contextualized, specific for the clinical context. So how do we make a version of trust that's specific to the clinical context? So actually, Meyer and Meyer do go a little bit more into what constitutes trust, saying that the trustee has to display certain qualities of trustworthiness. And these include ability, integrity, and benevolence. We'll see how these apply to AI in a little bit. But I wanted to focus right now on benevolence, because that's the idea that the trustee cares for the best interests of the trustor, or in a sense that they both have the same goals in mind. So I think in the clinical context, this really boils down to dedication to the shared goals of patient care and trainee learning. And so if these then are the foundation upon which that sort of vulnerability of learners and supervisors and patients are in the clinical learning environment, what additional sort of dynamic does this create with respect to trust? And to me, this sort of creates a system of reciprocal trust, where the supervisor assumes risk by entrusting the trainee, but the trainee also assumes risk by accepting that entrustment from the supervisor. That the supervisor will support safe patient care, and that the supervisor will also assess the trainee's ability appropriately to match that the tasks they're assigned with their level of competence. So in the next few slides, or for today's talk, I'll try to apply these concepts to AI essentially. So can we take those concepts of ability, integrity, and benevolence, apply them to AI tools that are sort of invading our workspace? And then in the second part, can AI human trust be reciprocal? I think that's a big question for me, because if AI human trust is not reciprocal, then I think maybe trust is the wrong concept to apply to AI. So in part one, how can we determine how much to trust AI? So the way we thought about this is to treat AI in a sense as if it was a new trainee in the clinical space. So if you have a new trainee in the clinical space, you don't automatically assign them the most acute patient right off the bat, or the most complex patient off the bat, right? You give them a level of autonomy or of responsibility that's suitable for their level of competence. So that's the whole concept behind Ola Tenkat, Karen Hauer, Carrie Chen, and other people's idea of entrustment in the EPAs. And also Duncan's done a lot of work in this area as well, Duncan and Dan. So we thought, can we apply this same type of concept to AI, treating AI instead as the trainee that's now invading our clinical space? So we wouldn't allow it to make clinical decisions right off the bat, and maybe never we would allow it to make such clinical decisions. So can we then take the same principles of entrustment and apply them to AI in a sort of anthropomorphized way? How well would that potentially work? So we have the scale going from no autonomy to full autonomy. Then there's 5 different factors that people have considered when deciding whether or not to trust AI. So this work actually was pioneered by Karen Hauer, Pat O'Sullivan, Ola Tenkat, and others here. And so they decided there were 5 factors, including the object of trust itself. So in this case, it's going to be AI instead of the trainee, or AI as a trainee, if you will. Then there's the complexity of the task, context, and so forth. So let's break it down. So with respect to the trustee or the object of trust, we talked about ability, integrity, and benevolence. So ability then has to do with how well it performs, how reliable it is, how accurate it is. So these are the things that are often discussed when one talks about open evidence, up to date, the AI version of that, and how relevant the material is, that how spot on it is to our clinical question. So that's sort of ability. Integrity has to do with how open and honest it is with the way it's generating its results. So with respect to open evidence or something like this, it has to do with, is there a way to trace how it's providing its answers? And they've been working on things like, providing citations and a little bit of reasoning here and there. But at the end of the day, I think it's still quite different than the sort of reasoning that you may encounter when reasoning with a human. So I think we're not quite there yet with respect to integrity either. Moreover, how many times has an AI been confident about something that it really should have been confident about, right? And has it said that you should do it this way, and you know that it's probably wrong, right? So AI really seems to have a problem with also this humility factor, if you will, which is a key component of I guess how entrustment works for humans, right? It's the ability to discern when one's knowledge is at its limits or one's ability is at its limits. So I think we need to start training some humble AIs if we're actually going to get to that point of integrity. And then benevolence, I think, is what we talked about earlier in terms of the shared goals of patient care and learning. And this is where I think you can't really ascribe that type of human characteristic to an AI, but maybe you can ascribe it to their developers. So we'll talk a little bit more, but I think AI itself is not really, you can't really attribute these type of factors to it, but you can maybe think of AI as a conduit between a user and the developers of the AI. So almost a conduit between humans. Okay, so let's move on to the other factor. So task. So task has to do with how complex the task is. So in a high acuity patient, a low acuity patient, and so forth. So this seems like something that may work for AI as well. And context is another one. So for the case of humans, it has to do with, is this happening at night, in the daytime, night shift? Are there a lot of people around? For an AI, it may more have to do with who are the other stakeholders that using AI may affect. How is it affecting the patient? Does the patient have a role potentially in searching the AI as well? And what is the value of adding AI additionally? Are we just replacing another human, and should we just be hiring humans instead? Or is there something we're actually accomplishing with the AI that we couldn't accomplish just by ourselves? So then it comes to ourselves and thinking about how much we even trust ourselves to potentially use AI responsibly. Are we going to use it such that we become totally dependent on it and we could lose skills over time? De-skilling, I think, is the term they use for that, or maybe even never develop skills if we start using it from day one in a new type of clinical practice. And so how much do we trust ourselves to use it responsibly? And lastly, there's the relationship with AI, which we'll talk a little bit about later, but I think really this is not the right way to think about it. And that even though there are studies that have looked at AI as a therapist or being used for CBT, DBT, that's this type of thing, I think that there's studies that go both ways in terms of whether human attachment to the AI is actually something that we want or not. And so maybe we shouldn't be thinking about relationships with the AI itself, but rather with the people who are developing it and how the AI itself is a conduit between our priorities and theirs. Okay, so let's try to apply that all to a entrustment scale. So we're very good at this because of the PEDS evaluations that we've had to fill out, right, in terms of the different EPA levels. And so we took that like modified O score and we tried to do something with the AI. So going from an entrustment level of 1 to AI being ineligible for any autonomous role in that task, all the way to number 5, which would be AI could take full autonomy for a given task. So maybe let's take the example of doing a literature review. And so maybe things that we would trust AI for completely would be very boring tasks, such as extracting titles, authors, and dates from papers. And AI seems to be doing a good job with that. I'll show you in a few slides that it's actually better than humans in doing this type of task. But we wouldn't want to trust AI to draft the final literature review, right? Even though there are tools like Elicit and even our tool that can write the whole literature review, that probably is not the point of research, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about why I think that that's not really legitimate either. And finally, in the middle, there can be the idea that maybe AI and humans can equally contribute to a given task. And for this example, it could be maybe extracting more complicated things such as the findings of the study or the results. So maybe we can use AI as a sounding board and compare how our extraction was to the AI itself, and see if there's anything we missed or maybe any ideas that the AI has thought of that we haven't thought of. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about this example with the data extraction tool that we've developed. So basically the idea is that if you have a stack of scientific papers or clinical papers that you want to then extract different features of them as you're writing the literature review. So like maybe what was the study type and so forth. So let's see. So basically here I have a bunch of papers that I've uploaded to the system. And I asked it a very frivolous question, is like, how do you form a musical band? So basically here's it searched PubMed for me. It came up with these, I don't even know how it found these on PubMed. So maybe actually they're from Semantic Scholar or something like that instead. Okay, so now I want to ask it various questions. So what was the purpose of the study? What's the study population? Then we can ask it more silly things like summarize the results of the study, providing your answer in the form of a haiku. What genre of music does the study represent? And anything else you want to ask?
Was the band any good?
Oh yeah, was the band, if applicable, in the study any good? All right, so we'll have it then process this. And so I think the value of this type of system is not necessarily in doing the sort of busy work for us, but probably in something that allows us to sort of pilot these research questions in a quick way, so that we can sort of refine our questions before using humans to do the extraction. So you can see that pretty quickly it went through all those papers and produced a table of these results essentially. So let's see, was the band any good? So I think it looks like they were getting a lot of NAs. So I think there were probably not very many case studies of band quality among the papers, but maybe I could find those next time. And let's see the haikus. I think it was this one. Haiku, collabs gauge their rise. Old masters linger in networks. Charts hinge on shared ties. So I have no idea what that means, but I guess it tried to provide us a quote to describe how it generated its answer as well. And so, if we had more time, what we can do is actually, if you run the AI a second time, it may give you a different answer each time. And so what you can actually do is run the AI or multiple different AIs different numbers of times, and then compare how those answers go together. And in that, you can sort of see basically how interpretable different questions are that you're asking. If you're asking about the title, then that's probably not very interpretable. But if it's about interpretation of results and so forth, you can get interesting results. So I think that was just an example to show you how a tool like that could potentially work. But let's now actually put the pedal to the metal, if you will, or try to see how well this does. So there was a paper that somebody wrote that's actually quite good because they published their entire extraction table openly so that one can see exactly what they extracted from each paper that they used and how they interpreted it. So we asked whether we could reproduce this table that was supposed to have been done by humans with AI and see how well AI would do compared to that human sample. So so basically we just asked the AI to reproduce exactly what the humans did. And so here we have compared different extraction questions that they asked, going from simple things like what's the title of the paper, country of origin, aims, and so forth, to things that are a little bit more complicated, including the study design, the AI rationale. And on the x-axis here, you basically see the similarity in the themes or in the responses between AI and humans. So you can see for simple questions like the title and the country of origin, that the AI tends to do pretty well compared to humans. But with things or questions that require more interpretation or that are more up for debate, essentially, then there's differences between the AI and the humans, in such that it's almost a 50% difference on this scale. So this sort of raises the question of like maybe there's differences that are fundamental to the questions themselves, that maybe it's interpretability that sort of decides and determines how similar AI and humans are to each other. But then the question becomes like, what is that standard of interpretability? For instance, if we did the study again using a different set of humans, would they be any more or less reliable than the AI to human comparison? So we did this extraction manually ourselves and created a group of re-extractors, and we found a similar pattern. So for the aims of the study, we were pretty consistent with that other group who wrote the original paper. But for things that required interpretation, like the AI rationale, we tended to differ quite a bit as well. And then when we compared this human-human comparison to the AI, there was essentially no difference. So essentially the humans and the AIs tended to have similar difficulty with questions that were interpretable in terms of being on the same page. So maybe that's a feature of the question themselves, of the research question, rather than of AI accuracy. So then we can drill down into the differences between AI and human responses. And so of all the different extraction questions we answered, about 75% of them were concordant, human and AI, and 25% were discordant. So then if we looked at these responses that were discordant, we found that the majority of this discordance is actually due to interpretive differences rather than actual factual differences. So the majority of these were differences in interpretations of the same questions that were justifiably different. And then the next 8% were actually differences in just levels of detail. So they were the same answer, but just different levels of detail. And then finally, 6% of them was because there were factual differences between the AI and the human responses. And so if we broke these factual differences down further, we found actually that the majority of the inaccuracies were committed by humans. So unfortunately, humans hallucinated more than AI for this particular example case. You know, and the generalizability of this is, you know, debatable because this was one particular study, but for at least this particular answer or this particular study, humans seem to hallucinate more than AI. So does this mean that we should be using AI for all our literature reviews going forward? Should we be using them for systematic reviews, for critical narrative reviews and things like this? And even should we be using it potentially for qualitative coding or medical records summarization and chart coding? Well, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for this given this type of, you know, seemingly good performance. But we'd argue actually that we shouldn't be using it for any of these. The reason being that AI lacks a reflexivity and a positionality. You know, some people say that, you know, AI has a bias, that it may favor certain groups over another, and that's the same thing as reflexivity, but really it's not. So I think reflexivity is really about the process of meaning making. It's the process of sort of struggling through the data, of going through that difficult step of trying to make those interpretations and fill out that table. And that is really not a neutral process. It's a process in which I guess biases can enter, but it's more than that. It's really about whose voices we elevate and whose voices that we suppress. And that's not really a responsibility that I think we should be giving to the AI. And furthermore, if we're using medical records to train an AI, even if that data is de-identified, when we're using it in that system, who essentially owns the data? Because sometimes with these AI systems, data becomes part of that AI, becomes part of its training. So it could become like the HeLa cells, right? Or other examples of where we've seen misappropriation of patient's agency. And so then what is the researcher's responsibility to the patient if we're going to use AI in this sort of fashion? And so now let's think about the question of reciprocal trust. So in the first half, we basically were asking the question of how much we should trust AI and thinking about its use in data extraction. And I think if we're going to go from a purely post-positivist view in terms of just like objectivity and so forth, then from the numbers standpoint, it seemed to do a pretty good job. But once we start to thinking about more of a post qualitative or post, a more holistic view of our interpretations, maybe it's time to take a step back. So now let's challenge AI again and ask you the question of, can AI human trust be reciprocal? So can AI display human-like qualities? It seems like it can, right? Because people are using it for creating, online personas and companions and whatnot. But then if we're starting to do this in the medical education space, then what are its implications on education and practice? So just reviewing reciprocal trust, right, there were these two aspects. So we'll just focus on a supervisor and a trainee. So supervisors accepting risk by granting responsibility to trainees, and trainees sort of taking a leap of faith to show their authentic practice, to be their true selves to the supervisor and not, sort of put on a show, right? To just only, show what they're doing best, right? Because if they can be more truthful about what their strengths and weaknesses are, then there'll be a better collaboration, one hopes, with the supervisor to help them achieve their learning goals. So how can AI potentially do that? And how may it not do that? So people have been really excited about this idea of a virtual patient or a virtual supervisor in the AI space. The idea is that, standardized patients are a limited resource. And in the first couple of years of medical school, maybe there's like 4 times I remember being able to work with this at the SPs. And so, maybe a great idea is that instead of waiting in line, you could create a virtual patient simulator that you can interact with anywhere when you're exercising, inside, outside, or maybe even when you're about to go to bed. Or maybe not, because then you'd have strange dreams about AI, and that's not the idea. So let's see how this could potentially work. And so, yeah, this was what I was trying to debug earlier. I think we'll see how it works, because the Wi-Fi I have to use my cell phone. Okay. Hi, Blanca. What brings you into the clinic today?
Last week, they've been happening every day, mostly in the afternoon or evening.
Oh, I see. That's very difficult sounding. Can you tell me a little bit more? How high have the fevers been going?
They've gone up to about 102 degrees, and Tylenol or ibuprofen helps for a few hours, but then it comes back.
I see. Is that so? Are you experiencing any other symptoms besides just the fevers?
I've been feeling really tired, and I'm having chills and night sweats too.
I see. I see. That's really unfortunate. Any rashes?
I've had some redness on my cheeks, kind of like a rash, but I thought maybe it's from my acne.
Wait, anything you want to ask the AI?
You lost any weight?
Lost any weight? Okay, let's try that. Have you lost any weight?
Yeah, my appetite's been off, and I've lost about 4 or 5 pounds this month.
Uh-oh. Any other ones? Any other questions?
Joint pain?
Joint pain. Okay, great. Any joint pain?
Yeah, my knees and ankles ache off and on, and sometimes my feet and ankles look a bit puffy.
So So I guess the next generation of this is trying to create sort of virtual environments that people can go into as well and do type a sort of virtual rounds. The idea not to replace rounds, but it is for medical students, I guess. I remember as you mentioned, I used to do the courtship associate director. I used to tell people to go practice in front of a mirror, right? And practice your presentation in front of a mirror. Well, why not put on goggles or use your phone, right? And practice with an AI. It's a pretty low stakes type of environment. So anyway, so that's sort of the next phase of that. And it's been recording everything we're saying. So another thing you could do with this is to bring in like a virtual supervisor. So someone that would see your interactions with the patient here.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Yeah, I know.
Are we still talking about my fevers and joint pain?
And so you can see here, yeah, so he recorded everything we said. So the supervisor is telling us to say, you lost the patient with off-topic commentary, reestablished rapport. Since you're so knowledgeable, tell me exactly how to repair this. So you could see, let's see what it says. I guess it's not excited about that. Or maybe it has to think deeply. Okay, but that's sort of the point of this just getting an idea behind the virtual patient and virtual supervisor simulation, that you can sort of have a low stakes practice. Oh, wow, it thought very long. Acknowledge and apologize. I am sorry I got off track. Let me refocus. And wow, so that's a bit long. So I think this supervisor needs some fine tuning. All right. Okay, so that was a quick demo of how that type of system can work and the potential uses that are envisioned for it. But let's see, what are the caveats? So I think with the enthusiasm, a lot of companies have sort of gone into the deep end already, sort of putting this type of system face-to-face with learners right away. In terms of this level 5 of human AI deployment, this highest level of trust. So I'd argue that actually that's a relatively dangerous thing to do, because especially if you're using it with first-year medical students. I remember as a first-year medical student, I could be, I would be easily influenced one way or the other, right? So if I didn't really have a good sense of whether something was true or not, whether the AI was hallucinating or not, or giving me a answer in a context that wouldn't make sense for my actual patient, then I could easily be misled with that. And even if I was told after the fact that you don't believe the AI, it'd still be in my head. So I'd argue that even jumping to level 5 like this right away is not a good idea. So what we've proposed to do is actually use AI to test AI itself. So in this sense, we've created we've created an entire class of fake AI learners in the sense, and we've sort of turned them loose on this system. So that's what we mean by crash test dummies. And essentially, we're using these fake learners to test AIs. So how do we do that? So we looked at the ACGME competencies, patient care, medical knowledge, et cetera, and then we sort of created a distribution of profiles for fake students. So some having high patient care skills, but low professionalism and so forth. And then we turned these loose onto the virtual patients that I just showed you earlier to create entirely synthetic conversations between different AIs acting in different roles. And so the question at the end of the day would be, if we then put these virtual students through virtual patient simulation curriculum, if you will, so like a patient with a broken arm, with a pediatric inpatient, and then, I don't know, maybe a parent conversation, and then we rated them with AIs and scored them on different items to assess these ACGME competencies, could we actually recover the competencies that we designed those virtual learners to have? So if the system is working well, then you should be able to realize that this student here who had high patient care skills also had low professionalism and so forth. So if this is actually working, then there should be some signal connecting one side to another. So actually at the end of the day, there was some signal. And so you can see here, actually for all 6 of the competencies, there was a statistically significant signal between the generating competency profiles and the estimated profiles that were sort of gathered from their interactions with the virtual patients and the sort of system of assessment that we had set up. So that made us feel a little bit more confident, at least, that we'd be able to identify true characteristics of the learners, and we'd be actually giving useful feedback potentially to the learners themselves. So that has made us feel a little bit more confident about testing this with humans now. Right. But, oh yeah.
PBLI, the one that had the not such great art.
Oh, this one. Yeah, that's a problem-based, practice-based learning and improvement. Yeah, so exactly, yeah, that one's the least well correlated, and I think that would make sense in this because this is basically data that's gotten from I think 3 or 4 different cases, and for PBLI, I think a lot of the items in that competency don't really correspond to what you could demonstrate just from a simulation like this. It'd be more about like, at least when I was writing the clerkship evaluations, would be more like, were they a good reading? Did they, what was it called? Did they integrate knowledge well from outside? And did their supervisors view them as someone who would take feedback well and this type of thing? And, the virtual supervisor, we didn't use the virtual supervisor in this simulation, but I think having the AI sort of judge whether or not they're taking feedback well would be a sort of dangerous task to do. So I think we probably want this one not to become too correlated. Otherwise, we may be overfitting, or we may be developing something that's doing a human task that we don't want it to do. Okay, great. Any other questions? Sorry, I've been talking a lot, but just since we're a little pause. Okay, so then, so I think we're starting to move to the next point now where we feel confident to actually test it with humans, but not to test it with sort of first-year medical students right away, but to use ourselves essentially as the testers, acting in roles as learners and seeing how the system works in that sense. So, okay. So going back to reciprocal trust then of both the supervisor acceptance of risk and the learner sort of taking a leap of faith to demonstrate their authentic practice, the question then becomes whether AI can participate in this sort of relationship with the learner in the same way. So you've probably heard of this term like a therapeutic alliance between a physician and a patient. And you may have also heard of this idea of an educational alliance between supervising attendings and learners, right? The idea is that if you can create a psychologically safe space, then people within that space, the learner and the supervisor can sort of co-construct feedback in a way that leads to more authentic exchange and learning. And so why I think that AI can't really do that is that because it can't reciprocate human trust that's necessary to form such a relationship. It lacks key affordances that are necessary for it to actually trust other humans, or not other humans, to trust humans in general. So that is that first of all, it can't really assume risk, right? If I am as a supervisor, I'm trusting a trainee with a given patient care task, I could be taking a big risk if that is, say, putting a central line or intubating or something like this, or even prescribing a medication. I can't tell you how many medical errors just come from things that seem to be benign, right? But at the same time, the AI doesn't bear that responsibility for that risk. I mean, we could threaten it by saying, we'll turn you off, right? Or we'll erase you, right? But it doesn't really care, right, at the end of the day. And ultimately, and maybe it's developers that care a little bit, but it's not the same as what we are ourselves as clinical supervisors. So it lacks that responsibility. It also lacks agency in the sense of being able to make decisions about whether to trust humans or not. And if we did put it in that role, I think it would be a scary a way to do or to use AI. I guess imagine that as residents, we'd have to go through some type of AI gauntlet to be able to qualify to be high level of trust. And so there'd probably be ways of gaming that system as well. So I think from an agency standpoint, it's probably not something we want to do either. And finally, from a relationship standpoint, I think that AI lacking consciousness or supposedly lacking consciousness, whatever one wants to believe, I think it still doesn't really form a relationship with a human in a way that humans and humans form relationships. And from the studies on, therapeutic relationships between AIs and humans, as in like psychiatry, the idea is basically that the relationship is in the eye of the beholder rather than mutual in this sense. And the AI doesn't really have the same capacities, the same emotional modeling, if you will, to represent a human that would allow it to actually engage in a meaningful relationship with a human. On the other hand, what can AI actually do in this trust dynamic? So I think in this sense, AI can serve as a mediator of human trust. It can mediate trust between different humans rather than replace that trust itself. So instead of having AI coaches develop trust in the learners themselves, the AI coaches, quote unquote, can help human coaches to analyze the human performance data. And instead of the AI virtual patient developing relationships with the learners, it can be a conduit by which the human supervisors then can sort of engage in this process with learners, maintain their engagement with it rather than just letting them, use these systems, in an autonomous way, but really create conversations between learners and humans instead. And so in this sense, AI functions more as a technological lens than as an actual entity to be entrusted itself. So it's like a stethoscope, a lab test or imaging study. I don't know if I've ever thought about trusting my stethoscope, to be honest, right? But it's some type of technology that helps me to view a system or view a heart, right? But it's not something that I sort of expect to trust me back. And furthermore, the lenses we use to interpret our world are not neutral, right? So in the sense we described with the research earlier, it can tend to elevate or suppress voices in differential ways. And being able to control that, I think, is important. It's not something we should let the AI take on by itself. So I want to conclude with this essay I had written that was about some things that were meaningful to me. So, okay. All right, so it goes like this. I left medical school because it was training me to become an AI. So about 20 years ago, I left medicine. I had just completed my third year in medical school, the core clerkships. And during that year, I had developed this very uncomfortable realization that I was being programmed like a computer, programmed to follow clinical algorithms, programmed to follow certain things to say, and programmed to react in certain ways. And there was always this constant pressure that some big brother or sister over my shoulder would try to tell me not to escape or bend those algorithmic lines. My father was a software engineer, and I had grown up learning to code before I even knew how to write or speak properly. Even though he passed on his computer science knowledge to me, when I entered college, he forbade me from majoring in CS, saying, do something else, combine it with other skills. And shortly after that, he entered hospice and passed away. But my experience with hospice drove me into medicine. The notion that one could still heal, even when physical healing was not to be had. The nurse that snuck my terminally ill dad a cup of peach jello when he refused to be NPO. And then his gleeful face upon receiving it. And no, he didn't choke to death. But that experience in hospice was not what I encountered in medical school. Instead, it was this jarring notion that for the rest of my life, professionalism meant that I'd have to follow clinical algorithms and social heuristics encoded by the hidden curriculum. And that time, I said I'd rather write clinical algorithms for computers to follow than to be programmed by them or program others to do the same. But after taking a long detour, I eventually did find my way back into medicine, as you all know. And what brought me back? It was probably that midnight birthday party we threw for a 1-year-old liver transplant patient and my attending who broke all the rules by buying balloons and stuffed animals for the whole floor. The same attending who kept a roster of every medical student he ever worked with on his office door. It was the stuff we did outside our algorithmic constraints and obligations that brought me back to medicine. So I'm not worried that AI may take over that part of medicine, the stuff that's, so I'm not worried that AI is going to take over that part of medicine, the stuff that's outside of the algorithms. But in some way, I'm less disappointed that it may eventually start to take over some of the things inside our algorithmic constraints. So where does that leave us as clinical educators? Where we may have to contend with our existential relevance in a future where AI triages patients, AI drives diagnostic inquiry, where it proposes treatment options, and AI even follows up with patients. Will AI be able to do shared decision-making with them? Will AI be able to contextualize recommendations to patients' goals of care? Will AI be able to will access to medical advice become commoditized to the point that patients seek providers only as much as a shopper seeks the advice of a sales representative. And don't get me wrong, the best educational experience I had for medicine was actually what I tell people was working in retail. That was maybe the best class I had, a retail 101, customer service, right? But the commoditization brought upon by AI could very well become reality if medicine doesn't continue to offer the relationships that define it beyond algorithmic care. Similarly, medical education risks becoming a completely automated, self-driven process if educational alliances between clinical supervisors and trainees aren't developed over often increasingly short windows of time on clinical rotations. But these relationships don't just depend on high-level interpretations of learner performance data. They grow from both complex and routine interactions. I will always remember the simple act of my supervisor staying after clinic to go over my incredibly unremarkable notes with me. In that effort, I saw the nurse that brought my dad Jell-O when he refused to be NPO. So as we move towards initiatives in quote unquote precision education, automated assessment and feedback, automated learning nudges, automated reflection, and even AI-driven entrustment decisions, let us not forget to build in the human interactions beyond high-level dashboard interpretations and analytics that drive coaching. Let's remember to save time to interact with the mundane, the routine, the low-yield observations in clinical practice that defy algorithmic measure, yet strengthen human-human bonds. Relationships we build with our trainees will be reflected in the relationships they build with their patients. Relationships that will keep us relevant in the future of algorithmically and AI practiced care. All right, thanks everyone. Okay, so love to hear your questions and ideas, sir. I guess.
It's very timely. Just last month, Congress held a hearing on screens in education, and although it wasn't specifically at med school, it was more K through 12, but there was a presentation that asked the question of not how is education better with screens and AI, but what is the best education look like? And they were asking themselves that question and then looking at the data, and they were finding that having, of course, more teachers, more personalization with humans is actually producing better outcomes for students rather than more screens. Even though you might have an example of using AI that is helping solve some complex problem or something, whatever Microsoft might herald as an example. So I think that, like I think about as you're thinking with education, curriculum design, are we asking that question of like, what does the best medical education look like for learners, not just in the context of AI, but from a broader lens?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And I think that the pendulum has swung both ways in the sense that when these AI tools sort of started to become realizable, then the pendulum sort of in the momentum swung towards let's just apply them without having necessarily a vision for what we want to do, or let's imagine a vision where we think or maybe have a presumptuous imagination of the future in which AI is actually doing things that maybe we don't want it to do and we haven't realized that we shouldn't do yet. And I think now that the pendulum is swinging the other way, we often talk about like human thriving or human, I can't remember what the term is. There's a popular term. Flourishing, thank you, human flourishing in that sense. So I think the time is ripe, like you're saying, for us to take a step back. Since like the question is not whether you can really do something with AI anymore, which is what it was like a year ago or two, right? And at that time, people were trying to outdo each other, trying to prove that they could do something that seemed impossible. Now the impossible just seems like possible. It's not exciting anymore. Before I used to go to like things like this and you could show like this virtual patients like be like a magician, right? And now it's like we see this all day long, and even our cars do that, talk to us, right? And so I think exactly like you're saying, it's time to maybe take a step back and think about how we can define what constitutes best practices and best ways of learning. And I think AI and some, the question comes about, does AI actually represent a epistemic shift in the way we think about learning and think about knowledge and the way we will practice with patients? And there's a nice, on one extreme, you could just say, oh, AI is really not more than Google, that what a search engine was before. It's just maybe better, more efficient, and maybe can contextualize things a little better than Google could and save us some of that work. But then I guess on the other side, people are saying that no, it actually will fundamentally change the way we take care of patients and maybe democratize care in some way that, before when patients use Dr. Google, now they can use Dr. OpenAI or whatever else type thing. And it could be a fundamentally different level in which this sort of knowledge is democratized. So I think that is very much open to debate. And I think we're trying to figure out from individual practices, what is the best practices? Because it's probably not so much up to the supervisors like myself anymore, who are kind of old, right? And not to use it in a derogatory way, but I think the learners are more adept with this technology than we are a lot of times and have spent more time with it. And so I think we're entering a new era of sort of co-production between learners and supervisors in order to figure out what are the best ways that we can learn from this. And I think as supervisors, we used to say we come up with these AI literacy, curricula and best practices on how to use AI. But really, I think we should be saying that let's work with the learners and hear what they are using it for and try to come up with try to use their experiences to co-create this together rather than just the supervisors trying to, create doctrine and things type of thing. So anyway, it's a long answer, but I think you're absolutely spot on, and that's where we need to go.
Right.
Yeah, Roberta.
Online question from Erica Evans, based on one of the earlier topics you covered. So I recently learned about a program that will summarize journal articles into 5-minute sound bites so you can stay on top of the literature in your field while commuting, exercising, etc. Based on your experience with what AI can and cannot be trusted to do you think that AI summaries of journal articles will be reliable enough, or potentially still too much error there?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think it maybe depends on the use case. So I think it could be a potential great use case if one wants to just stay abreast of the developments, similar to before, where there'd be digests, so like Peds in Review, or I mean not Peds in Review. I keep getting this email. Yeah, these type of briefs, right? And I had them all go to a certain folder because they were filling up my inbox. But anyway, I think AI could potentially have a role in that, especially if we could create them in ways that sort of represent the same priorities that we have as people reading the systems. But in terms of using AI to write a literature review and to rely on it for those summaries, I have to confess that I did early on, like 2 years ago, when this was a popular notion, write an entire literature review using the AI to do the summaries, and it was the worst AI, it was the worst literature review I ever wrote, because at the end of the day, the answers to the research questions were the same as what I started out with. The question I started out with was the same. I already knew the answers essentially, and I didn't learn anything new from doing any of the studies. And I think that was because if I actually had gone through the papers myself, I would have found things that contradicted my initial hypotheses, and I would have found this. I think AI is really prone to this confirmation bias type of situation, and unless you specifically train it to look for things that are apart from your model. But even then, I think it's still different than if you're reading the papers and sort of, wading in the complexity of that, if you will. So yeah, but so I think, using it for staying abreast of things, summarizing, I think that could be a great use case. But then I think, I wouldn't trust, open evidence or something like that to give me a more in-depth review. I would dive into it myself. Mm-hmm.
Although I've had more recent, since the 2 years ago.
Yeah.
It was terrible 2 years ago, but the more recent stuff definitely seems to be stronger. I've done a couple lit reviews through OpenAI that have been open evidence that have been very helpful,
mm-hmm.
and they give those link to the citation,
yeah.
right citation. They do, so I think it kind of depends on maybe how you frame the question, but also mm-hmm. they do seem to be as you well know, accelerating in their capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. At the same time, yeah, I'm like you're saying, I'm developing tools. I feel like I'm Jekyll and Hyde, because at one side I'm saying don't do it, but at the other side I'm doing what I'm saying don't do. And so, but I think you're right. There's probably I think they challenge each other in this sense. But I want the side to say don't do to win out, but I don't know. Sandrine.
So first of all, great talk. I always learn so much hearing you speak about these things. And I love the question about rethinking how we do education. Because one of the things that you mentioned earlier, and it was also in the New England Journal of Medicine paper about de-skilling and underskilling, it actually is one of the things that I'm thinking to myself, really, because it feels a little bit like, don't you use a calculator because you don't know anymore how to, and it's like nobody knows that anymore. Like, what are we doing as a medical education community and as probably academic community to make sure that we don't just hang on to these old ideas?
Yes.
Saying you should know how to, write a handwritten letter or whatever. We still teach our students to listen to the heart in 6 places.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Right? Because nobody diagnoses microstenosis based on that.
Yes, that's right.
So, like, what are we doing to be proactive rather than reactive? And start to sort out, because to me it sounds like there's actually a huge opportunity to change how we educate people, focusing much more on the relational aspect, much less on these skills and underskilling.
De-skilling, yeah, absolutely, yeah, I agree with you. That actually I wound up taking out the slide on the de-skilling type because I've started to move away from that idea over time, and I think you're absolutely right that it's, with any new technology, it's a sort of like it changes the way we approach data. It changes the way we approach, we interpret the data, and in some way it also changes the way we interact with other humans. And I think you're right that we probably should be embracing some of those changes rather than simply putting them off, as something taboo, right, or otherwise. And I think particularly. I saw, all the virtual patient thing. I started to poo-poo it, right? But those things are all things I'm spending like the majority of my time working on, and so at some part of me, I do believe that actually does have some value for learners, and I think it's similar to the question I answered for the first question earlier, in that I think we can co-discover the ways of using these systems with our learners, because I think we can imagine, right? We can use our existing theories in medical education to predict how potentially this virtual patient, virtual supervisor may affect the educational alliance or relationships or whatnot. But at the same time, there's going to be stuff that comes out of this interaction that don't fit any of those old theories. So I think we need to somehow create a safe sandbox in which we can sort of co-produce with our learners effective ways of learning, new ways of developing clinical practice, almost, if you will, but how do we sandbox that in a way that doesn't affect their learning and doesn't affect their patient care? So I think it's these types of infrastructures, of trust infrastructure, if you will, that are sort of the next step. Now that we have these capabilities, how do we do this all in a safe space and let those theories flourish, if you will, or develop from that space? Karen.
I don't have a question, but more of a comment, because as an old timer who still uses a calculator and has a lot of anxiety about AI, I can't think of a better person to be leading the field in this area. I don't know if people have trained with Brian before, but I think you still have your synthesizer in the hospital rooms. We used to play for the residents as a break and bringing food and everything. So you really will always be there thinking about the human side of it, which I think is so important. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.